Klamath Lake Massacre 1846, Kit Carson's bloodiest battle. A single shot pierces the Oregon night. In the darkness around Klamath Lake, 14 men jolt awake to find themselves surrounded by shadows that move like spirits through the trees. 3 of their companions already lie dead, their blood soaking into the wilderness soil. This is not just another frontier skirmish. This is the beginning of a massacre that will reshape the American West. Welcome to Native Legends and History Stories, where we uncover the raw, untold stories of America's frontier. If you're fascinated by the clash of cultures, the price of expansion, and the men who shaped our nation's destiny, subscribe now and join us on this journey through history. The night of May 9th, 1846, starts deceptively peaceful at Klamath Lake, Oregon. After traversing 60 grueling miles of treacherous mountain terrain, 14 seasoned mountain men finally allow themselves to rest. Their muscles ache from the day's journey, their clothes still damp from crossing ice-cold streams and fighting through dense underbrush. The camp they've made is strategic, positioned between the towering pines and the lake's shore, offering both shelter and escape routes if needed. These aren't ordinary frontiersmen. Among them are 3 Delaware warriors, their faces weathered by decades of tracking and hunting across territories that span from their ancestral eastern woodlands to these unfamiliar western mountains. Their unmatched skills in navigation and survival have saved countless expeditions from disaster. Their keen eyes have already noted every possible approach to the camp, every shadow that could hide a threat. Beside them lies Basil La Jeunesse, a French-born frontiersman whose life story reads like a novel of adventure. Born in the bustling fur-trading hub of St. Louis, he learned the ways of the wilderness from both Native American hunters and French-Canadian voyageurs. His knowledge of the territory's hidden trails and dangerous passages has made him invaluable to countless expeditions. Tonight, however, even his experienced instincts fail to sense the danger approaching. Leading this remarkable band is John C. Fremont, a man whose ambitions stretch as far as the territories he explores. His rise to prominence is a testament to both his natural abilities and his political acumen. As a former U.S. Army cartographer, his skill with maps and measurements is unquestionable. But it's his marriage into a powerful political family that has transformed him from a simple military man into a key player in America's westward expansion. His father-in-law's connections in Congress have secured him a prestigious appointment, officially to map the American West, unofficially to prepare these lands for American control. The territory they traverse is technically Mexican soil, though Mexico's claim to it is as thin as the mountain air. From the fertile San Joaquin Valley to the snow-capped peaks of the Cascade Mountains, the true power lies with the native tribes who have called these lands home for countless generations. The Mexican government, its authority diminished by distance and disinterest, maintains only a symbolic presence through a scattered string of missions clinging to the Pacific coast like seashells on a beach. This vacuum of power has created an irresistible opportunity for American expansion. Just as Texas a decade earlier had drawn ambitious settlers with promises of cheap land and minimal oversight, Northern California's vast, ungoverned spaces have become a magnet for a new wave of American pioneers. Farmers seeking fertile soil, ranchers dreaming of endless grazing lands, and entrepreneurs hoping to build their fortunes far from eastern constraints, all are drawn to this sparsely populated region where the total number of settlers barely reaches a few thousand. In Washington, D.C., President James K. Polk and his predecessor John Tyler have recognized this opportunity. Driven by the increasingly popular doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent is both inevitable and divinely ordained, they have set their sights on these territories. But before they can claim this land, they need to understand it. That's where Fremont's expeditions come in. His careful mapping of the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada range, his detailed reports of desert crossings and coastal approaches, are more than mere exploration. They're the groundwork for American conquest. Yet tonight, as Fremont's exhausted men surrender to sleep after their grueling 60-mile journey through Oregon's rugged terrain, they're unaware that they're about to become entangled in a violent conflict that will leave an indelible mark on this contested land. On the shores of Klamath Lake, Fremont's expedition encountered an unexpected visitor. U.S. Marine Lieutenant Archibald Gillespie emerged from the dense redwood forest, his uniform worn and muddy from weeks of relentless travel. The Marine officer had embarked on an extraordinary journey that began in Washington, D.C., where President James K. Polk personally entrusted him with confidential messages of national importance. Gillespie's path to Fremont had taken him first through Mexico City's crowded streets, where he carefully maintained his cover as a civilian merchant. From there, he boarded a merchant vessel bound for California, enduring weeks at sea before reaching Los Angeles. Upon arrival, he learned that Fremont's expedition had already moved hundreds of miles northward. Without hesitation, Gillespie began a grueling pursuit through California's diverse terrain, from the scorching valleys to the snow-capped Sierra Nevada mountains. His training as a Marine in the 1830s had prepared him for such challenges. He navigated through unmapped territories, crossed swollen rivers, and traversed mountain passes still deep with winter snow. He traveled light and fast, often covering 40 miles a day, knowing the urgency of his mission. The messages he carried, sealed in oilskin pouches and hidden within his clothing, contained instructions about the United States' growing interest in California, a territory that would become increasingly significant as tensions with Mexico escalated. Upon reaching Fremont's camp, Gillespie delivered both the official dispatches for the American consuls in Los Angeles and the private communications for Fremont himself. The contents of these letters remain a mystery to historians, though contemporary accounts suggest they detailed plans for California's annexation. The messages also likely contained intelligence about growing tensions between the United States and Mexico, as well as instructions for Fremont's role in the anticipated conflict. The impact of these communications transformed the expedition's atmosphere. Fremont spent hours studying the documents by lamplight, conferring with Gillespie in hushed tones. The urgent nature of their discussions led Fremont to make an unusual decision. He suspended the standard practice of posting night guards, allowing his exhausted men to rest without interruption. While most men in the company welcomed this rare opportunity for unbroken sleep, one seasoned frontiersman maintained his vigilance. Christopher Houston Carson, known throughout the territories as Kit Carson, had learned through decades of experience that comfort often preceded danger. At 37 years old, Carson had already lived several lifetimes' worth of adventures, his reputation spreading far beyond the frontier through popular dime novels published in eastern cities like New York, Philadelphia, Austin, and Washington, D.C. Carson's actual experiences surpassed even the most dramatic fictional accounts. His journey began in Kentucky, where he apprenticed to a saddlemaker at age 14, but soon fled the confines of civilization for the vast western territories. He learned the art of trapping from seasoned mountain men, mastered multiple Native American languages, and developed an encyclopedic knowledge of Western geography that few could match. His travels took him from the highest peaks of the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific coast, from the Mexican borderlands to the Canadian frontier. Throughout the 1830s, Carson rode with legendary trappers whose names became synonymous with the American frontier. Bill Williams, whose tracking skills were considered supernatural, Jim Bridger, who discovered the Great Salt Lake, and Ewing Young, who established the profitable California-Oregon trade route. Together they mapped unknown territories, established trading posts, and opened new routes that would later become major migration paths. Carson's personal life reflected the complex relationships between frontiersmen and Native American tribes. His first marriage in 1836 was to an Arapaho woman named Singing Grass. Their union produced 2 daughters and allowed Carson to gain intimate knowledge of Arapaho customs, language, and survival techniques. However, tragedy struck in 1839 when Singing Grass died from complications during her 3rd childbirth, leaving Carson to care for their young children alone. In the aftermath of this loss, Carson married a Cheyenne woman named Making Out Road. The marriage followed traditional Cheyenne customs, but cultural differences and the challenge of integrating his children from his previous marriage led to a swift divorce. Making out Rhodes' family refused to accept Carson's daughters, creating an untenable situation that forced him to choose between his new marriage and his children's welfare. The most devastating blow came in April 1842, when Carson's younger daughter, whose name was never recorded in historical documents, suffered a horrific accident. While playing near the trading post where they lived, she fell into a large vat of boiling soap being prepared for the spring cleaning. The tragedy prompted Carson to transport his surviving daughter to relatives in Missouri, where she could receive a formal education and the stability that his nomadic lifestyle couldn't provide. The chance meeting on a Missouri River steamboat marked the beginning of a complex partnership between two very different men. John C. Fremont, recognizing the frontiersman's reputation, engaged Carson in conversation and offered him a position as guide for his upcoming scientific expedition. Carson accepted, and within weeks found himself leading Fremont's party westward through territories he knew intimately. Between 1842 and 1846, Carson guided Fremont on two major expeditions across the American West. These journeys covered thousands of miles of challenging terrain, from the Rocky Mountains' treacherous passes to the arid expanses of the Great Basin. Throughout these expeditions, Carson's knowledge repeatedly saved the party from disaster. His ability to read weather patterns prevented them from being trapped in mountain snowstorms. His understanding of native territories helped them navigate potentially hostile areas. His tracking skills kept them supplied with game when provisions ran low. Despite these crucial contributions, Carson remained acutely aware of the social gulf between himself and his employer. Born into poverty and unable to read or write, he viewed his role through the lens of his humble origins. Even with his vast experience and proven capabilities, Carson consistently deferred to Fremont, the wealthy, educated Army officer with powerful political connections. This deference manifested itself on the evening of May 9th, when Carson, despite his misgivings, accepted Fremont's decision to forgo posting guards at their Klamath Lake camp. Carson's instincts, honed by decades on the frontier, warned him of potential danger. His concerns stemmed from recent violent encounters with native tribes throughout Northern California, particularly the devastating Wind Tomb Massacre just weeks earlier. The Wind Tomb Massacre, also documented as the Sacramento River Massacre, occurred in late March 1846. Upon reaching Lassen Ranch in the northern Sacramento Valley, Fremont's party received reports from settlers about an imminent native attack. Fremont, seeing an opportunity to enhance his military reputation and demonstrate American force in the region, assembled a substantial fighting force. His command included 60 Americans, 9 Delaware Indians, 2 California Indians, and 5 men from a nearby trading post. On April 5th, this force located a large Wind Tomb settlement. Though the village showed no signs of preparing for warfare, its size and location were enough for Fremont to order an attack. The assault came from 3 directions, catching the inhabitants completely unprepared. Thomas Breckinridge, who witnessed the event, recorded its brutality. The order was given to ask no quarter and to give none. The settlers charged into the village, taking the warriors by surprise, and then commenced a scene of slaughter which is unequaled in the West. The bucks, squaws, and papooses were shot down like sheep, and those men never stopped as long as they could find one alive. The massacre demonstrated Fremont's willingness to use overwhelming force against native populations, regardless of evidence of hostile intent. These events weighed heavily on Carson's mind as he lay in camp at Klamath Lake, his experienced instincts warning him of potential dangers despite his commander's confidence in their safety. The Wind Tomb Massacre left an indelible mark on the territory. Bodies littered the settlement and riverbanks, with death toll estimates ranging dramatically from 150 to 700 victims. The Sacramento River ran red with blood as scores of Wind Tomb people, including women and children, attempted to escape the gunfire by swimming. Many were shot in the water, while others, weighed down by heavy winter clothing, drowned in the swift current. The surviving witnesses carried stories of the carnage throughout Northern California and Oregon, describing in detail the dark-haired, long-bearded officer who commanded the mountain men during their brutal assault. Kit Carson had witnessed countless violent encounters throughout his decades on the frontier. He had participated in tribal wars, settler conflicts, and military campaigns. Each engagement had taught him valuable lessons about the intricate patterns of tribal warfare and revenge. The scale of the Wintu massacre surpassed typical frontier skirmishes, and Carson understood that such unprecedented bloodshed would demand an equally forceful response. The night of May 9th brought that response. After midnight, the natural rhythm of wilderness sounds filled the air around the sleeping camp at Klamath Lake. Waves lapped steadily against the rocky shore, their gentle splashing mixing with the soft crackle of dying coals in the campfire. Pine needles rustled overhead as occasional gusts of wind swept down from the mountains. The familiar sounds masked approaching footsteps until a dull, heavy thump broke through the night's routine noise. Carson's eyes snapped open. Years of frontier life had trained him to wake instantly at unusual sounds. The campfire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light across the sleeping forms of his companions. At first, nothing seemed out of place in the darkness. Then Carson noticed Basil La Jeunesse lying in an unnatural position nearby. "What's the matter over there, Basil?" Carson called out, already reaching for his pistol. The firelight caught something wet and dark spreading across La Jeunesse's head and upper body. The experienced mountain man recognized the signs immediately. His friend had been killed by a war club, the weapon striking with enough force to split his skull while he slept. "Indians!" Carson's warning cry echoed through the camp as he discharged his pistol into the surrounding darkness. The muzzle flash briefly illuminated shadowy figures moving between the trees. His longtime companions, Lucian Maxwell, Alex Godey, and Dick Owens, sprang to action with practiced efficiency. They drew pistols and tomahawks, pressing their backs together to defend against attacks from all sides. Steel gleamed in the firelight as arrows whistled through the air, thudding into tree trunks and the ground around them. Crane, a Delaware tracker known for his exceptional marksmanship, grabbed his rifle and took aim at the moving shadows. The weapon failed to fire, either unloaded in the rush to sleep or compromised by the damp night air. Undeterred, Crane swung the heavy rifle like a club as several warriors charged through the camp. His position directly in front of the campfire silhouetted him against the flames, making him an easy target. Multiple arrows struck him simultaneously, the impact lifting him off his feet before he crumpled to the ground. Carson heard a deep, pained groan from his right. Turning, he saw Denny, another Delaware tracker who had served with him through numerous expeditions, lying motionless on the blood-soaked earth. There was no time to mourn. Carson shifted his attention back to the center of camp, where the firelight revealed an extraordinary sight. A lone warrior stood his ground amidst the chaos, his presence commanding attention. War paint covered his body in intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the flickering light. A magnificent headdress adorned with eagle feathers marked his high status. Unlike the other attackers who struck quickly and retreated into darkness, this warrior fought with direct, calculated fury. His steel tomahawk, a weapon that represented the blending of native and European technologies, flashed as he engaged multiple defenders. War cries in his native tongue echoed through the camp, spurring on his fellow warriors. The warrior's bearing, weapons, and tactical position led Carson and the other experienced mountain men to recognize him as a chief, even in the midst of battle. Multiple rifles and pistols discharged simultaneously, their combined firepower bringing down the warrior chief. He collapsed beside the campfire, his imposing figure now motionless on the blood-soaked ground. For the next hour, waves of attackers emerged from the darkness, in sporadic, disorganized attempts to retrieve their fallen leader's body. The defending mountain men maintained a steady barrage of gunfire, forcing each rescue attempt to retreat into the shadows. The attacks gradually diminished in frequency and intensity until silence finally reclaimed the forest. The survivors remained vigilant through the remaining hours of darkness, weapons ready, ears straining for any sound that might signal another assault. Each snapping twig or rustle of leaves brought an immediate response as exhausted men pivoted toward potential threats, fingers tight on triggers. Dawn revealed the full extent of the night's violence as sunlight crept over the jagged mountain peaks surrounding Klamath Lake. The morning air carried the acrid smell of spent gunpowder mixed with the metallic scent of blood. The men moved through their grim morning tasks, carefully wrapping the bodies of Denny, Crane, and La Jeunesse in wool blankets. These men had been more than companions. They were brothers, forged through years of shared hardship on the frontier. Carson and Fremont approached the fallen chief's body for examination. The warrior's elaborate war paint, applied in sharp geometric patterns with bright mineral pigments, stood in stark contrast to his cold, lifeless form. His war bonnet, once magnificent with its array of eagle feathers, lay crushed beneath him. Carson, who had previously dismissed the Klamath as treacherous and primitive, found himself studying the fallen leader with unexpected respect. "The bravest Indian I ever saw," he would write years later in his memoirs. The sight of his dead companions, however, overwhelmed any admiration. Rage and grief surged through Carson's body. His hands shook as he untied the leather thong securing a tomahawk to the chief's wrist. The weapon was a masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship, its heavy iron head perfectly balanced by a smooth wooden handle that felt natural in the grip. Carson tested the razor-sharp edge with his thumb, appreciating the weapon's deadly efficiency. Then something snapped within him. In a display of fury that startled both Fremont and Gillespie, Carson raised the tomahawk and brought it down on the dead chief's face with devastating force. The initial impact spurred him into a frenzy. Again and again he struck, each blow fueled by memories of his fallen friends, until the chief's features were, as Carson later described, all knocked to pieces. When exhaustion finally tempered his rage, Carson and Fremont discussed their next steps. Both men agreed immediately. Revenge would be their priority. But first, they needed to properly lay their dead to rest. The gruesome task of preparing the bodies for burial proved more challenging than anticipated. They secured the blanket-wrapped corpses sideways across their horses, planning to find a scenic spot along the lakeshore for a proper burial. The dense forest had other plans. Low-hanging branches and close-set trees repeatedly knocked the bodies from their precarious positions. Each impact caused fresh damage to the already broken forms. After several attempts, the men could no longer bear to see their friends' bodies subjected to such indignities. They chose a clearing in the forest for the burial site. The soil was inhospitable, cold, rocky, and unyielding to their efforts. With only knives as tools, the men took turns scraping and clawing at the frozen ground. Hours passed as they worked to create a single grave large enough to hold all three bodies. The physical labor offered some outlet for their grief, but the inadequacy of the burial site weighed heavily on their conscience. The burial itself was brief but solemn. The Delaware members of the party performed their traditional rituals, singing ancient songs of passage meant to guide their fallen brothers to the afterlife. The other men offered Christian prayers, their voices rough with emotion. They carefully positioned the bodies in the shallow grave, then covered them with a protective layer of rocks and logs to prevent predators from disturbing their rest. With the burial complete, the men's raw emotions crystallized into a singular purpose: retribution. The Delaware Scouts, their own burial rites complete, were the first to venture into the maze-like forest in search of any remaining Klamath warriors. After completing their burial duties, one Delaware Scout returned to the main group, his face lined with exhaustion. "Was sick, better now," he reported simply, indicating that he had taken a scalp in revenge for his fallen companions. Without delay, Carson assembled a small group, including the Delaware Scouts, to track along Klamath Lake's shoreline, searching for native settlements. They moved swiftly and silently, putting nearly 10 miles between themselves and Fremont's slower-moving main party. Their search yielded results when they discovered the largest Klamath village in the region. The settlement sprawled along the waterfront, with numerous wooden huts arranged in traditional patterns. Men were out in canoes on the lake, fishing in the morning light. Women worked at daily tasks while children played between the dwellings. The peaceful scene was about to shatter. Despite the scouts' careful approach, a village lookout spotted the armed group. Shouts of alarm echoed across the water. Women grabbed their children and fled in all directions, disappearing into the surrounding forest. The village men scrambled for weapons, while those in fishing canoes paddled frantically toward shore, their catches forgotten in the rush to defend their homes. The fishermen beached their canoes with such force that several craft splintered against the rocky shoreline. Carson, realizing they had lost the advantage of surprise, knew any delay would give the Klamath time to organize a proper defense. He ordered an immediate attack. His men charged into the village, weapons ready. What followed was another scene of wholesale slaughter. Though Carson would later maintain that his men had spared women and children, subsequent investigations found evidence contradicting this claim. Among the dead lay at least one elderly woman, her body discovered near the entrance of a burning hut. The attackers systematically set fire to every structure in the village. Carson stood watching the conflagration, describing it in his reports as a beautiful sight to behold. Flames consumed the wooden dwellings while thick black smoke rose into the morning sky, visible for miles across the lake. Fremont arrived with the main party as the village burned, clearly disappointed to have missed the primary action. The army officer's frustration at being left behind during the attack was evident in his bearing and sharp commands to his men. However, an opportunity for personal glory soon presented itself. As Carson walked through the smoldering village assessing the destruction his small force had wrought, movement caught his eye. A lone Klamath warrior, returning to find his home in ruins, raised his bow and drew an arrow aimed directly at Carson's chest. Carson reacted instantly, drawing and triggering his pistol, but the weapon failed to fire, the powder likely dampened by morning mist. The warrior's arrow never flew. Fremont, spotting the threat from several yards away, spurred his massive gray stallion Sacramento toward the Klamath man. The war horse's hooves struck with devastating force, throwing the warrior to the ground. Before he could recover, a Delaware fighter named Segunde leaped forward and brought a war club down with lethal precision, ending the warrior's life. This dramatic intervention by Fremont profoundly affected Carson's relationship with his commander. Though already loyal, Carson's devotion to Fremont became absolute after this incident, a dedication that would persist throughout his remaining years. Standing amid the ruins of the largest Klamath settlement in the region, with dead warriors scattered across the ground, Carson and Fremont discussed their next steps. The secret communications delivered by Lieutenant Gillespie now took precedence. A rebellion against Mexican authority was brewing in California, and both men would play crucial roles in the coming conflict. The party turned south, leaving behind a devastated community, the village still burning, survivors scattered into the wilderness, and the dead unburied. The destruction proved permanent. The surviving Klamath never rebuilt their village, instead dispersing among other bands and settlements. The site remained abandoned, a stark testament to the violence of that morning. Years later, historical research would reveal a tragic irony. The Klamath people had likely played no part in the attack on Fremont's camp that had prompted this retribution. Evidence suggested that the true perpetrators were their traditional enemies, the Modoc tribe, who shared cultural ties but had a long history of conflict with the Klamath. The village and its people had paid a devastating price for a crime they had not committed. In his memoirs, Carson described the massacre simply as a perfect butchery, his words betraying no remorse for the bloodshed. The events at Klamath Lake marked just one chapter in the remarkable lives of Carson and Fremont. Both men would rise to unprecedented heights in American history. Carson as the legendary frontier scout who shaped the expansion of the American West, and Fremont as a military leader, presidential candidate, and one of California's first senators. Their actions that May morning in 1846 perfectly captured the brutal reality of America's westward expansion, a complex tapestry of courage and cruelty, survival and sacrifice, triumph and tragedy. The power these men wielded would influence the fate of nations and reshape the American frontier forever. Thank you for experiencing this remarkable piece of history with us. Until our next adventure in the American frontier, this is Native Legends and History Stories, where every tale reveals the raw truth of our shared past.